Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you can see lots more interesting conversations to come. But today we're actually going to take a trip from Boston and Cambridge, where I am, to the great city of Detroit in the upper Midwest, which is one of the most fascinating urban places in all of America, with an amazing history. And we're going to do that with none other than Ned Staebler, who is the Vice President of Economic Development at Wayne State. And before I go on too much further, Ned, let me welcome you to Unplanned.
Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate you having me here.
Well, it's great to have you. And we're going to get into a lot of stuff about the work you're doing both at Wayne State, and I understand you're also connected to something called Tech Town. You can tell us all about that. But why don't you start by just describing what it is you're doing now at Wayne State? What's the job? What's the responsibilities? And what do you see as what you're trying to achieve there?
So almost 10 years ago, a previous president of the university called me up and asked if I would do economic development for the university. And I said, what's economic development for a university? And he said, I don't know, let's figure it out. And so the last 10 years has been a journey to really lead the university's efforts across campus to be a catalyst for inclusive growth. So universities have all these assets, but typically they're focused very inwardly, on research and on student education, which are obviously core missions for the university. But there's also this huge potential to be an economic driver in their communities. And so my job has really been to get the university to understand that 2 + 2 is 5, and they can do their academic and research missions more effectively while and if they're having a huge external effect on their local communities.
That sounds fascinating. And it's probably worth noting that we met on a trip that you were doing in conjunction with, I think, the Brookings Institute around innovation districts. And one of the core concepts there, I understand it because here in Cambridge, we have an innovation district as well, is that there's a driver. There's kind of an anchor tenant that helps make these things go and grow. So what have you found out? So 10 years ago, you were trying to figure out what this is all about. We do want to touch on Detroit and its history, because of course that plays a big role here, but what have you found out so far?
Well, you can't separate what we're doing at the university from Detroit and its history. That historical context really continues to permeate everything to this day. But hands-on, and as a result, our work is all focused on inclusive economic development. So many groups, when they come to do economic development, especially technology-based or things like that, think, okay, great, we'll put a tech accelerator in, and that'll attract all these high-techy people and blah 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 blah. And what they really forget is that to have sustainable economic growth, you need the people that live in your community to benefit from said economic growth. And it really doesn't trickle down so much from just bringing in some tech companies to help bring that growth. What you end up doing is gentrifying. I'll give you an example. On that very trip, we checked out Cambridge, and then we went down to Boston, on the innovation district on the harbor there. And what we saw was that, when they drew the little lines on the map and said, this is going to be an innovation district, real estate speculators came in, bought up a ton of the real estate, and suddenly you had $1 million plus condos going in everywhere. So we've been really conscious in Detroit to make sure that on this recovery, everybody gets to participate in it, because that's the only way you can be sustainable.
Well, let's put a point on that, because just as I was doing a little prep for this conversation, I did take a quick look at the census data for the city. And I understand that the city and the county are maybe different things. And but what I saw was, let's talk about race first: 78% Black, 14% white, and then the remainders, others. Median income about $31,000, something there. 80 some odd percent with a high school education, but about 15% with a college degree, 4-year college degree. How do you begin to address or attack those problems? You are based at a university after all, but I'm sure it's challenging.
Absolutely. I mean, those are real issues. There's two sides to it though. So the one is, okay, how do you move those numbers? How do you move the needle on those numbers? And Wayne State is a tier one research university. We're not MIT or Harvard, I get it, but we are a top tier research university. We're also a university of access. So I mean, we have an urban mission. We have a mission to serve our local community, and we weren't doing a great job of it. Our graduation rate as a whole was really bad, in the 20s, 24, 25%. For Black students, it was down. Black males, it was in single digits. I mean, like 8 or 9%. That's horrible, right? We were clearly failing at that part of our mission. 10 years later, and I'm not taking any credit for it, I'm just mentioning over the time frame that I've been there, because it coincided.
I don't know one way or the other. I'll give you some.
Fair enough. I did 100% of all of this. But there's a huge team of student success folks at the university that I'm not a part of, really, that have changed it. So our graduation rate now as a whole is up over 50%. Our African-American graduation rate has more than doubled. And for Black males, it's more than tripled. We're really trying to change that piece of that equation, those numbers you just
how are you doing it? Because these numbers are hard. One of the things you were pointing out about Boston and Cambridge, but it's true around the world, it's true around the globe, right? Money tends to attract money, and talent tends to attract more talent. But if you're not starting with that sort of base condition, it's hard to turn it around. And that's no comment on the people. It's just a fact of the fact. So how do you start to think about that?
Great point. I mean, there's a negative spiral there, right? Like that you can get into, but similarly, you can have a positive cycle as well. So, money to some extent is, when you have one of those spirals, you can synthesize that. You can prop up one of those. So things like hiring a bunch more advisors, right? At a real base level, and there's no magic bullet. I think our student success team put in place 40 or 50 different initiatives over the last decade to try things, to test things, to attack different parts of the problem. But I would say that all of it goes back to looking for barriers, identifying them, and trying to remove them. Whether that's a class that is just everyone's flunking this one particular class because of the way it's taught, and maybe dance majors don't need to have calculus to graduate. Maybe they don't. And that was a real thing. We were still using a curriculum from 50 years ago that perhaps wasn't as necessary, to critical race theory, to a trauma-informed approach, really looking at the students that we have here. What are their barriers? How do we remove them? How do we create learning communities to support them? How do we have more representative leadership? How do we have people who are teaching and guiding them that look like and have similar experiences to our students? So it's a whole sort of holistic approach to doing it. And the last piece, don't admit students that aren't ready for college. There was a big push, get everybody in here. And, with the stimulus package in 2009 and all that, there was a lot of money for folks to go to college. And we admitted a lot of students that probably weren't ready for college and needed to spend a couple years in community college or getting an associate's or things like that. And so we stopped doing that, and it's really helped.
Well, all this stuff is so fascinating, and it really gets to the heart of kind of some of the core urban issues that we all grapple with, no matter where you are on the planet. Detroit is so fascinating, though, because I had the chance to come out and visit a couple of years ago, and there is that whole experience of all the buildings that are now collapsing and falling apart. But my biggest takeaway was, in some ways, in the physical fabric, you actually see the history of the 20th century of America. You see the growth in the early part of the 1900s and the expansion of the industrial base. Exactly. And why don't you, and let me finish my point. You can tell us what we're looking at behind you.
Yeah.
And then as you get to the post-war era, obviously the war, by which we mean the Second World War, was probably brought a lot of wealth to Detroit. But then in the 60s and 70s, the sort of collapse of the industrial base, and now you're in the rebuild mode. Talk to us a little bit about that, and tell us what we're looking at behind you, because I love that room that you've got behind you.
This is my favorite room in Detroit, maybe in the world. I view it as sort of the Sistine Chapel of industry. And this is Diego Rivera's industry murals in the Rivera Court. You can't obviously see it, but it's actually all four sides around me would be covered in this mural. And it is really a tribute to industry and the workers. And it shows, interestingly, it was done in the 20s. It was commissioned for the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is where I am right now. The Ford family, as in Ford Motor, was a huge patron of this. Edsel Ford, I think, commissioned this. But Diego Rivera was a socialist. Like, he very much believed in the people. And so he shows the exploitation, as well as it was really the hard work and sweat and danger that people were willing to put themselves into to build this great country. There's a whole side of, as you see here, cars, but there's also planes and bombs and, the war machine and gas. It's really an interesting mural. But in fact, when it was finished, there was an outcry. People wanted to rip it down. And to their credit, the Ford family and Edsel really said, no, this is important. It needs to stay. But it is, I think, really informative as to how Detroit evolved. So, your audience is largely planning people and people interested in cities. So Detroit, people always want to focus on the issue of Detroit is from 1960 census, when there was 1.9 million people, to 2000, when there was about 1 million people. So we lost close to 1 million people in 50 years. I'm sorry, 2010, in 50 years. But no one ever wants to focus on 1915 to 1925, when these murals were getting done and when Detroit was growing. So Henry Ford doubles the daily wage to $5 a day, not out of altruism. That's a whole nother episode. And the northern migration happens with the industrialization of the North, and 1 million people in 10 years arrive in the city of Detroit. In 10 years, 1 million people show up.
Wait, let's just pause for a second and just try to imagine what that means. I mean, the housing, the transportation, the food, the requirements for food and water and all those things.
Sam, it gets worse. There was no master plan. There was no zoning. They didn't have all that until the 40s and the 50s. These people just showed up, and what did they do? Well, they were putting up factories as fast as they could, and they just built houses around them. Oh, and these aren't these nice, and I know people don't think of factories as clean right now, but compared to the factories back in the 20s, these things are like, Lysol. Those things, there were no coal scrubbers and filters. When they turned on those things, a layer of soot landed on your house and, the whole neighborhood around you.
Right.
And that's how people lived in the 20s and 30s. So it's no wonder that when we fast forward to the 60s and the 70s, as these factories are outliving their use and they're no longer being built up like they were because you needed to be near turbines, they're building these long assembly line things out in the suburbs that people were happy to get out of there. They were like, I want to get out of this hellhole I've been living in of soot and garbage next to a factory filled with trucks coming in every day and trains going by to service these factories. And that's all part of the industrial past that has formed our present today in Detroit.
Well, let's jump to today, because one of the fascinating things is Detroit is, I was going to say trying to redo, but it is. It's got that sort of core of the 21st century. And it's really an interesting balance, because you have all this old industrial history, but you also have sort of core pockets of what we might call the 21st century economy of that's more thought-based and much, much cleaner, maybe based in computers or in science or tech or basic entrepreneurship. How is that whole transformation coming along, and how do you assess it right now? And maybe we can sort of bridge into Tech Town a little bit in that side of the conversation.
Absolutely. So it's mixed before COVID, and everything I think is going to be colored, at least for the next year or two, in a pre-COVID, post-COVID landscape. Pre-COVID, we finally had sort of the shoots of a recovery that were taking hold in Detroit. It was starting to grow somewhat organically, at least in core areas. So Detroit's about 140 square miles. There is a core part of downtown, which it includes a riverfront and then a spine, if you will. Think of an inverted T, that is about 7.2 square miles. So of the 140, 7 square miles is sort of this greater downtown, midtown corridor area. It was starting to see growth that was organic without the needs for as many incentives and things like that. You're starting to see some gentrification, et cetera. We're starting to have some more first world type problems in these areas, but there was still 130 square miles that just wasn't seeing that. There were little pockets starting to come up, and we were just starting to say, okay, now let's get this growth out into these neighborhoods with things like the Strategic Neighborhood Fund and various investment paths. The tech side of it, fine. It was okay, but we were still having the problem of how do you get talent to fuel that growth when you're in a underinvested in community, when you're, there's this so much of the city that's not developed and not, frankly, very attractive to outsiders. And the people who were getting these jobs were largely outsiders. They weren't for people in the city. So it's a great segue to Tech Town, because as Tech Town implies, we very much were focused on 21st century knowledge economy. How do we grow those types of jobs? But about 8 years ago, we realized that there was a huge demand as well for non-tech businesses. And frankly, the same techniques you use, we use a version of Lean Startup to help those tech businesses through a business model canvas and a customer discovery process. It works for non-tech businesses too.
What's the type of non-tech business you're talking about? Because this is, of course, also fascinating, and it does get into, and this show is not about our political discussions either locally or nationally, but it does get into that issue of, if I'm not going to be a bench lab scientist at Novartis or Pfizer, but I've got some skills and I've got some energy, how do I get myself off of a $6 an hour job or whatever they are?
They're a little more now, but you're right, that is a real problem. We need to pay people more, first of all, but that's a whole nother episode as well. But so when we talk about
non-tech jobs, these sort of non-tech jobs,
non-tech, I really mean non-tech. I mean restaurants and coffee shops and barber shops and retail, boutiques and whatnot. All the things that provide quality of life and fabric to a community, but also jobs and opportunity and amenities and intergenerational wealth, right? So if you own a restaurant, you can hand that down to your kids and the grandkids. They can work in it. They can build a chain of them. People used to tell me all the time, oh, those aren't, high growth jobs. And I'd say, okay, or high growth companies or industries. I'd say, let's go over to Little Caesars Arena and have that conversation, because 50 years ago, that was a pizza place that a mom and pop started. And now there's, they have 2,000 pizza places. We'll go over to Domino's Farms, the largest office park in Michigan, which is Domino's Pizza. Let's go to Home Depot. Let's go to hardware stores, restaurants, those things, all coffee shops. Don't tell me Starbucks or whatever isn't a high growth business. So they're different. They're not, I get it. They're not Facebook, but that's okay. They're, in some ways, thank goodness they're not Facebook.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So that's very interesting. This show started, and I say this pretty much now every episode, because COVID happened. And all of a sudden I had this, this brainwave of, wow, it's actually allowed us to run the experiment we never thought we could run, which is we've been able to shut down an entire city for an entire day. We never thought we'd do that. But it exposed both the strengths of the community and the urban center, but also the weaknesses, the many, many, many weaknesses. What happened, or what has happened in Detroit through COVID? I mean, I assume it's been hard, like everywhere else, maybe harder. I don't know. What's been the experience out there?
So it has been harder in Detroit. So it's been similar, but probably more pronounced. And I'll tell you why. So nationally, you look at it, certain sectors have been fine. At a certain level of our economy, actually employment in the higher educated, those numbers are actually back to pre-COVID levels or even a little higher. But if you get down, especially into restaurants and retail and hospitality, those kinds of sectors, revenues nationally are down 20-25%, and locations, the number of those places that are open right now is down 30%. Many of them are not coming back. They just aren't. And why is that? It's because that nationally we saw small businesses having about, before COVID, 2 weeks, 47% of small businesses had 2 weeks or less of operating cash on hand. Now, why was it worse in Detroit? Because if you go into Hispanic neighborhoods, that number jumps to 89%. And if you go into Black neighborhoods, it's up to 94%. We're looking at entrepreneurs that have far less wealth. I mean, the average African-American family in this country has 1/10 the net worth of the average white family in this country. And that's just a massive problem, especially when 80% of the cash to start a small business comes from personal savings or from family. So if you don't have personal savings and your family didn't have any money, it's so much harder to either start or to survive something like COVID. So that's been our experience here, but it's the same. I mean, to some extent, it's the same everywhere in the country, which is why I'm calling for a national, maybe it's done at state levels, whatever, but I think the national government needs to do it, intentional Main Street small business program. And I don't just mean money
let me jump in, because this is the point of the show. I mean, we obviously could talk for hours and hours and hours, fascinating stuff, where I thank you for joining us on.
Oh, no.
But where do you see this going? I want to give you I'm going to give you three heads up of questions I'm going to ask you. Where do you see this going? I want you to think of your advertisement for Detroit, because I went out there a couple of years ago, first time I'd ever been there in my life. And from an urban planner's perspective, it's an absolutely fascinating place. And I've told my friends here on the East Coast, if I was minus 15 years, am I 20 years younger, I would be out there just doing something, because there's so much going on there. So that's the third. And then finally, we're going to touch on your 15 minutes of fame. But where do you see this going? I just, on the previous episode of Unplanned, and I'll share it with you, I just talked to a guy named Jeff Levine, who's an urban planner, and he's looked with a graduate student at MIT at main streets in smaller old industrial cores, including Massachusetts, New Hampshire, also Lansing, Michigan. He looked at Lansing, and he's come up with a set of recommendations from a sort of planner's eye view. But what's your where do you see this going? What's your thoughts on that?
First of all, I'd love to see those, right? Because this is not a zero-sum game. He doesn't come up with the plan for Boston, and we can't use it somewhere else. That's the beauty of cities, right? And it's part of why I met you, coming on a tour to see what you were doing, and then you've reciprocated.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I'd love to see those. But this is what I think. The reason why the next big focus of economic development is going to be around those Main Street commercial corridors is because every town has them. It's not just the big cities. Every little town does too. And that's makes them so politically popular. So easy to say to every state representative or mayor or whatever you might have, or congressperson, why don't you help out these businesses on Main Street? When we open new ones to refill these storefronts, you're going to get to go there and do the ribbon cutting. And now you're going to know the guy who owns the local coffee shop or pizza place. Who doesn't love that? I mean, that's retail politics at its absolute best. And guess what? It's also economics at its best. Those local dollars that cycle back through a community, and in underserved or post-industrial towns like a Lansing, which was home to Oldsmobile and things like that, or Detroit or Flint, or even some of the towns on the East Coast that were maybe in textiles or steel.
No, we've got a ton. We've got a ton of those communities.
Yeah,
in the Northeast. Actually.
You've got empty spaces for them, and you don't have amenities in those towns. Property values are low, but why would I ever move to that town if I got to drive 20 minutes to get a cup of coffee or to hit a nice restaurant or to do my shopping? So if you can help people in those communities to open up new things that create amenities in those communities, suddenly, you hear, oh, it's got such a cute little downtown. People love that. And they want to live near places where you can walk and shop and eat and live in those sort of 15-minute walkable communities, which raises property values. It creates that virtuous cycle that we were talking about before.
So let me push you on to the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what is your advertisement for Detroit? I personally find it an absolutely fascinating city. I still have the same recommendation to people. Particularly if you're out of an urban planning program and you're interested in cities and how they work, there's few places that are more fascinating, both from the history point of view, but also from where they are right now. What's your, come to Detroit pitch?
That's the beauty of Detroit, is we have the history, right? We have these beautiful old buildings Now, we've unfortunately knocked down too many of them, but there are still tons of really gorgeous ones up and around. We have a history. We're not a blank slate. There are a couple hundred years of real history here and character. It's very cool to be in Detroit, but there's also a tremendous amount of opportunity here because we lack so many of those basic amenities that we need. So you can come and start a business with a lot of support from the community and generate that intergenerational wealth. You can really live the American dream here, and people are going to be supportive of it. They're going to enjoy it. And frankly, it's just cool. I mean, Detroit is a cool city.
It's a very, very cool city. I,
Yeah.
I can't, I mean, I can imagine if you're in it and working in it, the problems sometimes must feel overwhelming. My own personal experience of driving down a street where almost all of that, I mean, this very strange experience of almost all the houses are abandoned, are empty, and are in some form of collapse. And then there's one house in the middle of the street where there's still somebody living in there. And you think, gosh, from a psychological point of view, how does that impact that person's life to live on that street? But it's also a fascinating experience too, and could use some energy and smarts to address some of those issues.
Smart people, come on down. You're welcome here.
All right, so finally, I want to touch on something that we both know about. You have what we've been calling your 15 minutes of fame, and I'll let you set it up, but let's just give the general overview of, we just had a national election. Michigan, there were a couple of states where it was really, really important what was going on in those states. Michigan was one of those, and you spoke out on an issue and spoke clearly and strongly, and it got into the national news. And I guess that's the setup. I'll let you take it from there. What was your 15 minutes of fame?
I know we're already over time, so I'll be quick, but essentially, most people have never even heard of these things, but they're called boards of canvassers. And that's how weird this election was. We learned a lot about things that people, that we didn't know happened, that were just behind the scenes administrative. But anyway, so Michigan voted for Joe Biden by about 150,000 votes. It wasn't particularly close. But then what happens is you have to go and certify the votes. And we got wind that the Republican Party was going to contest the certification. We don't know why. There was no real valid reason. It was all legit, but they were going to do it. So at this Wayne County, which is the county that includes the city of Detroit, Board of Canvassers meeting, the two Republican members, and there's two of each, Republican members decided to vote against certifying the election. And during their discussion of it, it had come out that their ostensible reason for not certifying was that there were irregularities in Detroit. There were a couple hundred ballots potentially that they weren't certain about had they been properly handled. This is out of 250,000. I mean, this is not out of, this is not a big number. And he won by, as I said, 150,000 votes. Whereas in some of the suburban communities, including a city called Livonia, which is 85, 90% white, 90+% white, where there were more irregularities than there were in any precinct in Detroit. They were fine certifying Livonia, but not Detroit. And really, it was just a blatant power grab. And it's around historical racism. Detroit, which is 80+%, I know it's a little under that now, Black. Livonia is very, very white. That's been a segregation sort of dichotomy here in this community for more than my entire life. Before that. So it's okay to say Detroit, there must be some fraud there because those people, et cetera, et cetera. And I basically spoke out and said, look, your name, if you do this, your name is going to go down in history as racist and is going to go down with other historical racists like Bull Connor and George Wallace and some of those other folks. And it wasn't just me, 150 other people spoke. And after an hour or so, they changed their vote, which was remarkable. I didn't think they would do that. But they did. And fortunately, it looks like things have sorted themselves out.
Yes, let's hope they have finally sorted themselves out and that we can start to work on some of these issues that you've outlined so clearly and so well in all our cities, all our communities, with the help of all levels of government and community and all the players that are required in doing this kind of work. Ned Staebler, I want to just thank you so much for joining us on Unplanned. It's always a pleasure talking to you. and fascinating to hear about your work. And I hope maybe we can get you back on sometime.
Hey, whenever you want, I'd love to be back. There's obviously, I think we just scratched the surface on a whole bunch of issues. And Sam, obviously you're great. I can't wait till after this COVID thing, have you back out to Detroit, and we can show you some of the highlights.